With half of the world's population of 7 billion living in countries rich in oil, gas, and minerals, the question must be asked, why so many of them live in abject poverty? There is no doubt that with good governance, the exploitation of these resources can generate large revenues to foster growth and reduce poverty. However, when governance is weak, it may result in poverty, corruption, and conflict. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, aims to strengthen governance by improving transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. The EITI supports improved governance in resource-rich countries through the verification and full publication of company payments and government revenues from oil, gas, and mining. It is in essence a coalition of governments, companies, civil society groups, investors, and international organizations. The EITI has a robust yet flexible methodology that ensures a global standard is maintained throughout the different implementing countries, with its board and international secretariat being the guardians of that methodology. Implementation itself, however, is the responsibility of individual countries. The EITI is therefore a globally developed standard that promotes revenue transparency at the local level. With 45% of Trinidad and Tobago's gross domestic product linked to the energy sector, the government has decided to join the EITI to ensure that there is the highest levels of transparency and accountability. As part of this move, Trinidad and Tobago has to become EITI compliant, and this involves the setting up of institution and legislative changes to ensure that the requirements of transparency have the force of law behind them and can be adequately administered. In an effort to achieve this EITI compliance, the government has set up a multi-sectoral steering committee to oversee the process, and that committee is headed by Victor Hart. As chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Victor Hart is the chairman of the committee that functions essentially as a board of directors overseeing the secretariat of the TTEITI. Mr. Hart has, for years, championed the need for transparency and accountability in government, and as the chairman of the committee, he says he hopes to ensure that the establishment of the TTEITI will lead to greater accountability, greater transparency, and greater trust in government and its institutions. The TTEITI will monitor not just oil and gas, but also the quarrying sector and the mining of asphalt. Trinidad and Tobago gained membership of the body on March 1, 2011, and has 2.5 years from this date to become EITI compliant. The way the EITI is expected to work in Trinidad and Tobago is to ensure that the money that companies say they pay the government is in fact what the governments receive, and there is no leakage. Gone will be the days of the reporting of general revenues earned from the energy sector, and instead we will be able to know specifically what the upstream companies like BPTT or BGTT or even Petrotrin pay to the government as taxes or profit oil or royalties. If it is then discovered that there is a difference between what the companies report paying to the government and what the government actually receives, then the difference will have to be explained.
You want to be able to do that by finding out from company A and B by compulsion that annually they have to declare what they pay to the Trinidad and Tobago government. And by compulsion, the Trinidad and Tobago government in turn has to publish what it says companies A and B paid. And those figures, if necessary, have to be reconciled in the event that there is a discrepancy between the two sets of figures.
Mr. Hart told a recent seminar designed to assist stakeholders in understanding the process of becoming EITI compliant that his committee sees the TTEITI doing more than simply reconciling accounts.
If EITI is to be really meaningful in terms of sustainable development for peoples whose countries are members of EITI, EITI has to go deeper and EITI has to go broader. And that is why you might hear references to EITI Basic which is just a simple matter of reconciling numbers, and EITI plus and EITI plus plus, where you extend that exercise horizontally and you deepen it to expose the kind of answers that you have, just to the questions that you have just posed, so that we would come to a time in Trinidad and Tobago where we not only know the preliminary answers to the reconciliation of the numbers, but we could be looking at the contracts, for instance, to see whether the contracts entered into for oil or gas exploitation are in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago.
We have heard the stories of people in host communities complaining that they do not benefit from the extraction of the resources in their parts of the country. While Mr. Hart gives an example of how EITI can be meaningful, particularly for host communities.
People in the Mayaro area, Point Galiute, people in the Maruga area, people in Point Fortin, people in the Point Lisas area might say, well, we are generating all this wealth through the activities associated with the exploitation of natural resources. Yet we don't have a hospital in this area. We don't have enough schools in the area, or maybe the roads are not paved. So the time will come when, in fact, we are going to be questioning why people in whose areas the exploitation is taking place are not better served by the income from those industries.
But at the end of the day, it is important that all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago take an active role in the EITI. It is, after all, about the issue of governance and ensuring that the country collects all the money it can from those oil, gas, and mining companies operating in Trinidad and Tobago.
The EIT, if it's anything, is an exercise in protecting the patrimony of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The resources belong to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and as of now, there is no way by which the people are informed in very simple and easily accessible means what is happening in terms of the exploitation of their resources. That is, how much money is it being generated and by which companies.
For Mr. Hart, it is about ensuring that the people know how their money is being collected and used. In order to achieve this, the buy-in must come from the average man in the street, and not just from the energy sector companies, the government, and civil society.
The man in the street needs to be educated about EITI. He has to see this as an exercise being done in his name and in the name of his children, yet unborn. The protection of the country's patrimony. And they must get involved in a very serious way. And without that involvement, then the EITI implementation would fail. So we see it as a very, very critical element in our strategies of EITI implementation.
For Dr. Thackeray Driver, it is also crucial that there is support from the traditional media, because they play a crucial role in the formulation of public opinion. According to the CEO of the Energy Chamber, the media has thus far not taken a position on the EITI, and he feels that needs to change.
Interestingly, I don't think that the media has been a particularly strong supporter for EIT implementation in Trinidad and Tobago, and they've not really taken a strong position, except that we've had one very senior energy sector journalist, probably our most senior energy sector journalist, David Rennick, who's taken a strong position against EITI implementation. So interestingly, the media has not taken a strong position, and that's perhaps something which the steering committee needs to think about and think as that a group we need to find somewhere reaching out to talk with and get their views on it. Them not just as reporters on specific on an event and an opening ceremony, but actually, are they consistently going to support EITI in editorial policy of the newspaper?
Wade Mark was appointed Speaker of the House of Representatives following the victory of the People's Partnership at the 2010 polls. However, before that, he was the leader of the opposition business in the Senate. And during his tenure, he brought a motion to the upper house calling for the then government to become a member of the global EITI organization. Speaker Mark says he is happy that Trinidad and Tobago is finally moving to become EITI compliant, and it augurs well for direct investment in the country.
It will bring great benefits in terms of investors' confidence. It will promote greater governance principles, between company and government, and not to mention and or to forget the critical level of citizen participation in this whole exercise. So I believe all in all, it will bring about, for instance, Trinidad and Tobago being recognized as a country in which one can do business in, where the playing field will be leveled, and as Victor Hart indicated, the international publications, whether it's the Human Development Report or whether it is the Perception of Corruption Index, all these things are going to be enhanced in the interest of the citizenry of TNT.
The speaker also suggests that EITI compliance could lead to greater levels of investment in the country because of the confidence and transparency that membership of this organization brings. The CEO of the Energy Chamber agrees with the speaker. Dr. Driver says implementation of the EITI will be good for investor confidence. And since the energy sector companies have in the main already signed up to the global EITI, there is no need for concern about investor confidence.
But most of our major oil and gas companies have said that they're committed to EITI. So I don't see how it's going to quite scare them away. They said they want to see this being implemented. In fact, over the last 6 years or so, one of the calls I often got from corporate communications, government affairs in the major oil and gas companies in Trinidad and Tobago was, Dax, do you know what's going on with EIT implementation in Trinidad and Tobago? The head office is asking me.
The speaker dismisses suggestions that there is no need for Trinidad and Tobago to join the EITI because of systems of accountability in the collection and use of revenues, notably the national budget. Mr. Mark says the national budget is not enough.
I myself have argued that the whole budgeting or budgetary process in Trinidad and Tobago is very archaic, outworn, and dated. We need to really move to a higher plane as it relates to budgeting in Trinidad and Tobago. And I myself believe that, at the level of the Parliament, we are going to be mounting seminars very shortly on this whole question about greater transparency and accountability as it relates to budgeting in our country.
Dr. Driver says some of the major challenges that Trinidad and Tobago will face in becoming EITI compliant will have to do with the administrative and legislative changes that are necessary. Insisting that it is not a criticism of any public officer, Dr. Driver says the fact is that the public service has strict guidelines in the way they operate, and the EITI may require changes in their modus operandi. In the circumstances, Dr. Driver says he was particularly happy that the Inland Revenue Division had representation on the TTEITI Steering Committee. He was, however, particularly cautious about the length of time it takes to change legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly legislation that is highly technical and is not politically expedient.
So we're going to need consistent monitoring of progress by the steering committee, and the government's going to have to be committed to removing those administrative barriers. Without that commitment, then we will, with all the will in the world, have trouble implementing EITI.
Dr. Driver says it is good that many of the major oil and gas companies operating in Trinidad and Tobago have already shown their commitment to the principles of transparency and have signed onto the EITI.
So BG, BHP, BP, Chevron, Repsol, RWE, name you may not have seen so much, but they're a new player in Trinidad in some of the offshore new acreage. Total, again, a name you don't see very often, they are a shareholder in some of the developments in Trinidad. Those companies are all signatories, all companies who have committed to EITI implementation. That's a formal process. They submit a form to the EITI board. I think it's reviewed annually to ensure that they have sort of lived up to that commitment. So we can hold those companies accountable for EITI implementation.
Dr. Yor Kaspari works with the World Bank and is part of the team assisting Trinidad and Tobago with its effort to become EITI compliant. He explains that EITI has moved from its more humble beginnings in the early 2000s and has now emerged as a popular brand name in extractive resource governance and is one of the governance initiatives being undertaken worldwide. He says at present there are 30 countries involved in the implementation of the EITI and an increasing number of them becoming EITI compliant. Dr. Kaspari says the role of the World Bank is to aid countries in their effort to implement the EITI at the national level.
The World Bank has two functions in promoting EITI, or rather in aiding EITI implementation at the national level. Firstly, we provide so-called technical assistance for EITI implementation, which basically means that we over time have become experts in EITI implementation through our work in so many countries that are trying to implement EITI, that we're now in a position to help countries implement EITI and provide technical solutions for what this means on the ground.
The implementation of the EITI has costs to it because the Secretariat has to be established, and with it, people with specific skill sets have to be hired. Office space and communications equipment need to be provided, along with other simple things like stationery. These all have costs to them, and while host governments are expected to assist in meeting some of the costs associated with the functioning of the EITI, there are times when its establishment may come when funds have not been budgeted for its implementation. This is in part where the World Bank comes in by providing financial support for the implementation.
So we sit essentially on a big pot of money, the so-called multi-donor trust fund for EITI that has been established by a number of donor countries, mostly from Western Europe, but also from Canada, Australia, and a number of other countries. And with that, we finance the EITI implementation effort in these countries.
There have been those who have asked, why should Trinidad and Tobago join the EITI, especially when many developed countries are not members of the organization? In fact, there are those who suggest that many of the members of the EITI can be considered failed states. Well, Dr. Kaspari responds in this way.
The simple answer being that few of them have as high of a percentage of oil, gas, or mining products in their GDP or in their exports as many of the current EITI implementing countries. But nonetheless, we now do see an increasing number of rich countries starting to implement the EITI.
Mr. Hart adds that it has been shown that the population in resource-rich countries have not benefited from the wealth generated by those countries in the way that they ought to.
As a result, civil society organizations, both in developed and developing countries, felt that this phenomenon had to be stopped. They even found a name for it, the resource curse, that countries with valuable resources were cursed in a way that the citizens were living in poverty because the leaders of these countries and the leaders of companies that were exploiting the resources engaged in mismanagement and sometimes corruption.
Mr. Hart insists that the TTEITI is about bringing transparency and accountability to resource management in Trinidad and Tobago.